Hello, this is our lecture over culture. Again, this is a miniature lecture, kind of a primer on the very main points of culture that I want you to know. First off, what is culture? Culture is very simply the assemblage of the language, customs, traditions, values, and beliefs that a society holds. So it is everything we think, everything we do, what is good and valued, what is not valuable, how we talk, our holidays, all those things that bind us together, that we share as a common people in some way, that is culture. So again, it is our shared language, custom, traditions, values, and beliefs. The combination of all of that is what we call culture. All right, there are important components of culture. The most important two to know are the idea that culture is material and non-material. And what this means is that our culture can be defined by both our things, tactile things that we can see and touch, as well as ideas and thoughts and non-tangible things. So, for example, material culture. 1,000 years from now, our society is long and gone, and Indiana Jones Jr. comes to excavate our society. He's going to dig things up. He's going to find the foundations of this building. He might find the bodies of our cars and our roads and the things that we used. We do this now when you go to Italy, and they had Mount Vesuvius. They see the things they use in day-to-day life. If you go to Mesa Verde, they see the pots and the pottery and all those things. Looking at our objects, we can piece together what a society did, what it valued, and that kind of thing. One easy example of how these reflect our values is the size of our homes. The average house has more than doubled in square footage in the past 50 years. You used to have 2-car garages, now we have 3-car garages. We have a whole industry of storage sheds to simply store our stuff we can't fit in our houses. That reflects our affluent culture and how much we acquire things. So someone coming back years later can look at these objects and say, oh, they value this in their society. This is what is important to them. This reflects their culture. Culture is also revealed in our ideas. Our technologies, things that we can't see, are still part of culture. The idea of the American dream and working hard to get ahead, that is very much an American cultural norm. We very much admire individuals and people that pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Freedom, democracy, there's a whole bunch of different things that we value as Americans. Every country has these kind of things. So that's non-material culture. The traditions, what we do at our holidays, how we celebrate Christmas or Kwanzaa or Valentine's Day or whatever holiday happens to be around, there are different things tied to it. Some are secular, some are religious, some are tied to certain countries, and they get absorbed into other countries. But all of it comes together and makes part of our culture. So the things that we do and share together, we can't touch those, they still matter. That is the non-material side of culture. So, culture defined, components of culture. Another term I want you to know is what's called culture shock. Because culture is so all-encompassing, it can be kind of a warm, nice blanket around us. When we stay in the culture we were raised in and what we know, it's comfortable. When we get taken outside of our culture and placed somewhere else, we can have what is called culture shock. All the things we thought we knew about the world and how things are supposed to happen, we don't know that anymore in a foreign culture. Hand gestures, where you sit, how important it is to be on time. There's all kinds of things that are cultural that we have to learn. Culture is not automatic. We have to learn it. So there can be a great deal of shock when we're the fish out of water. Half of our movies that are funny deal with taking someone from one culture or somewhere else and putting them somewhere else. Because watching us suffer through that can be humorous. It's also tough. So trying to understand another culture, when all we have is our own, that can be culture shock. A couple more terms I want you to know is the idea of ethnocentrism and cultural relativism. Now we do these two terms together, They are opposite things. Ethnocentrism means you judge other cultures by the standards of your own. So for example, in Western culture, we tend to marry for romance. We marry for love, personal connection. In Eastern cultures, it is much more common to have arranged marriages. Your parents might decide who you're going to marry, and you marry first and fall in love second. That's very foreign to us. Now you can recognize that as different, that's okay. To make fun of that and think that's weird or that's horrible or how could they do that, that's ethnocentrism because you're judging that culture by your own standards. Someone from that culture might very well think our way of doing things is crazy and weird because it's not the culture they're used to. So when you assess other cultures and try to understand them, you need to understand them from their point of view, not yours. If you do that, that is cultural relativism. So ethnocentrism is judging. Relativism is looking at it on its own merits. I'm not going to judge your culture by my own standards. I'm going to judge your culture by your standards and what you do. I want to try and understand your culture. That's cultural relativism. So you need to know those two terms. And lastly, the idea of culture versus society. The terms get used interchangeably. Remember again that society is a group of people who share a culture, who interact with each other, and have an area. Culture is part of society. It is not the same thing. So again, society is a bigger basket than culture. Culture is part of a society. It is not the same thing. All right, the very last thing I want you to know about culture is the idea that culture is learned, shared, symbolic, integrated, and has language. First, culture is learned. There's nothing automatic about culture. You're not born day one knowing all of America's customs and traditions. You don't speak English. You don't know how close to stand to somebody. You don't know what the proper time to respond to a text message is. All these little subtle, important, not so important rules that help us go with the flow every day, you have to learn that. And really, you can't learn it unless you're immersed in that culture. So culture is learned. It has to be transmitted to you. You do not pick it up on your own automatically. Culture is shared. You cannot have a culture of one. So again, it's shared customs, shared language, shared beliefs, shared traditions. It's what binds a society together. It is done by large groups in society. You might have subcultures that have different things to them, different components, but any kind of culture has to be shared among people. Culture is symbolic. There are things in our culture that we know what they stand for. One of the big controversies we had last year, and probably still will have, is the idea of players kneeling during the national anthem. Part of that is because the symbol of the flag, what it stands for, what it represents, why it matters so much to some people, is what is driving the public response to this. The act of kneeling itself, the physical act, is not all that important. What is important is the symbolic nature of it vis-a-vis the U.S. flag and the national anthem. People have very visceral reactions to that because, again, the flag is a symbol in our culture. It means things. Culture is integrated. So again, because it is shared, culture is woven throughout. We'll come back to it. I'll hit it here in a minute, but our language reflects our culture. The symbols, we believe in freedom and democracy. We have a flag that represents that. July 4th is a huge holiday. It's all interwoven. So the language, the traditions, the sharing, all of it, it all ties in and reinforces. So culture is learned, shared, symbolic, and it is integrated. And the last thing to know about culture before we wrap this up, culture has language. Language is perhaps the most strongly identifiable aspect of culture. If you want to know if someone is part of your culture or not right away, there are other cues you can pick up on from these other things. But if someone speaks a different language than you, you immediately know you're not part of the culture. And again, this gets important when you have English first debates and that kind of thing. The language itself has a symbolic nature. It's integrated. It's important. And one more concept from language I want you to know is what's called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Sapir is S-A-P-I-R-W-H-O-R-F. And it takes off on the false, not assumption, but the false saying that Eskimos have 50 words for snow. This is not true, but that statement has to do with the idea that because they live somewhere cold and they see snow all the time, they need lots of words to describe different types of snow. This concept is true. Culture and language cannot be taken apart. The easiest thing to see in our language, how our culture is embedded, is we have a long patriarchal tradition. Our language reflects that. I'm old enough that when I was a kid, we were still taught not to use his or her. We always use the male pronoun by default. People are using actor more and more to cover both females and males, but the fact that we have gender, actor, actress, waiter, waitress, steward, stewardess, the female version of a term, again, our culture views men and women differently. We're not unique. It's in our language. More subtle things in our titles. Mr. is the only commonly used title for a man. Doesn't tell you if he's married or not. For females, we have Miss, M-I-S-S, Miss, M-S, and then Mrs., M-R-S. So in our titles, we embed marital status for women, but not for men. That tells us something about our culture. When we get married, women generally change their last names. That's the expectation. So again, that's a language thing, what word we use. And then even in our slang. We'll come to this later on in class when we get to gender more, but again, just a small component of this. When you think about the terms for a woman that does not marry, spinster, old maid, there's all kinds of derisive terms for a woman who does not marry. For a man who's never married, you might get bachelor, playboy, something like that. You don't have the same negative connotations. And we'll kind of tease this for a later on lecture, but when you come to sexual activity, a woman who is sexually active has a whole lot longer list of terms for her than a male does. That's tied to language, it's tied to culture, and what we value. So our language is very much integral to all of this. You understand a culture through its language because it is so important and so tied. So that's culture in a nutshell. That is your mini lecture for this topic. Thank you and have a great day.